Welcome. October is Tom Lea month here in El Paso. Why is it so important to devote an entire month to this native El Pasoan? Well, Adair Margo is here to enlighten us on the topic. Welcome, Adair.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me back.
Yes, well, you, as the founder of the Tom Lea Institute, I think it's, or is it the foundation? I never quite.
Tom Lea Institute.
Yeah, okay, good. I was right the first time. You know, obviously you feel Tom Lea is an incredibly important figure. So just briefly, who's Tom Lea?
Well, Tom Lea was a native El Pasoan who achieved a great deal during the 20th century, especially as a writer, both novels and history, a painter, everything from large murals to small illustrations. He was on the bestseller list with Hemingway and Steinbeck, and he chose to always live in El Paso. And I think he is important in that he, as Robert Caro said, he was an unsung genius of our time who made it purely on the quality of his work. He stayed here, did not join groups and live in another place, but chose to remain in El Paso where he felt at home.
And so we're devoting an entire month to commemorating him. Is there enough to devote an entire month to one individual? It's pretty remarkable.
Well, that's the thing, and I'm discovering this as I go on, because Tom's work was not about himself. There is no limit to the themes that we can explore, because his work really was about life, and it was about life on our border, but it was also about life around the world, because he participated in such a big way as an artist, not in the art world, but in the world.
So he wasn't one of those exclusive types of artists who hung out with other artists and were part of the arts community per se. He was more involved in the world and traveling around the world and that kind of thing? Or?
He was. He wasn't part of the art world. And, you know, of course, most of us gravitate to our worlds, you know, because it's kind of a place where you can live and contribute. But Tom was, the best way I can say it is he had his own head against the sky. And anyway, he lived such a magnificent life, and it's good to have good examples to look towards. So he's someone who was extraordinary.
So he's really a role model in many respects, as a world citizen, as a native El Pasoan, as a man of the arts, and in many respects, sounds like. Over how many years did his career span?
Well, he was born in 1907. You know, he did, when he went to El Paso High School, you know, he did the senior annual. Oh my, so,
I didn't realize that.
That was, I might get confused, 22, I think, when he,
somewhere around
there. So, you know, his career began early. He always knew he wanted to be an artist. We've started a digital library and have scanned old family photographs, and there's some of him really as maybe a 12-year-old standing, working at an easel with sort of a smock on, you know, so I think he knew always that he wanted to be an artist. But he went to the Art Institute of Chicago in the 20s, so until he died, he could not work the final couple of years, but, you know, it was a good 80, you know, 70 some odd years that his career spanned. He died in 2001.
Oh, okay, that's a pretty long
almost
period
a century.
Of time. Yeah, pretty amazing. What is there for the average person in Tom Lea and Tom Lea month? One usually thinks of art and paintings and that kind of thing as something for the intellectual elite. So.
Yeah, and Tom was, I remember in a book called The Picture Gallery, he talked about, he wasn't going to try to guess what people in the art world talked about, and he wasn't going to correct the way they did it, but he really was interested in doing pictures that when you say your average man, just people, it gave him great pleasure, joy, when people would recognize, people who knew horses would recognize an aspect of a horse that was how they knew it, or that people who really knew the geology of our area would comment that the green on his mountains was not just some green up there, but it would actually be where green would be as rivulets were coming down the side of a mountain. That brought him joy, that people who knew the subject recognized it. So his work really is for everybody. And I have found that people in all walks of life, love Tom Lea. His big giants in our federal courthouse have inspired people for decades. And everyone has enjoyed them because they can recognize who those giants are and what kind of pants they wore and boots and what kind of saddles and bridles and spurs, and because he really was interested in real life and real things and not making things up.
So he was not one of those artists where you look at the paintings and go, what's that kind of thing. He really was interested in accurately portraying real life, but bringing something extra to it. What was that something extra? Because it's not like a photograph. There's something extra to his paintings.
No, it's hard to get at. And of course, Tom did work in abstraction too, but he never turned it into a philosophy. He enjoyed it for the design aspects of it and the color aspects of it. But Tom, I think his work helps us discover something about what we see. It's like it's painted. His teacher always taught him to get the structure underneath first. And so there's something very deep. We recognize it, but it's done from the inside out. And it has he always said his work was at its best when it wasn't just an incident or not just a place or a thing that happened, but that it transcended that and went to the symbolic. And I think most of his work does contain that aspect, that when you look at it and you see a little prospector at the base of Mount Franklin looking up for a glimmer of gold, you see something metaphorical in that, something that all of us can experience living on here if we look long enough at our mountain. The wonder that's there, the beauty that's there.
Yeah, and hope and anticipation and all of those things. And that really is a sign of a great piece of art, or whether it be photograph or anything, that it does capture something that's transcendent that we wouldn't see just in normal life per se.
Right.
That it's a snapshot of something transcendent, even though it's an average thing or a normal situation.
Right. So, you kind of see yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You said it best.
Well, are there things that children can enjoy about Tom Lea Month?
There are. They are going to have, in fact, they're going to have Sketch in the Gallery at the Museum of Art. They're going to have story times dealing with the Southwest. Tom Lea did a mural that's very beloved at our museum. He did it for his little brother, who was almost 20 years younger than he. And they're going to have story times about the Southwest. We're having an Art of War conference at Fort Bliss, but afterwards, Fort Bliss is going to give tours to people from the public who would like to come. And I asked specifically because there were grandmothers who would like to take their grandsons or grandchildren if families would be welcome, and they said yes. So there are several activities there's going to be a band concert, the Army Band, at the El Paso History Museum, and Tom Lea as a little boy remembered going out to Fort Bliss and everybody would park their cars around the bandstand and honk instead of clap when the music was over. He said they honked a long time after hearing Sousa's marches.
Oh, great. That's a cute story. Now, the art of war is something that is particularly powerful in Tom Lea's repertoire of paintings that he's done. Why is that?
Well, Tom Lea, he was a civilian. He went to war with Life magazine and got to write his own ticket. And that ticket included landing on Peleliu with the 7th Marines. So he was in a very deadly situation with Marines. But Tom he always said his experience at war, it was almost as if he was disembodied, like he wasn't even there. Because I think he felt this real a commitment to the soldiers. He loved the people with whom he served. He loved being on an aircraft carrier for 2 months and seeing how it functioned as a living thing, not as a piece of metal and men in war, but a living thing. So Tom, when he came back from war, he felt very committed to documenting what soldiers had experienced or what the Marines had experienced at Peleliu. That was very different from the 20th century, most of the 20th century, as we learn art, what happened in New York City after World War II, when artists began inventing an internal world and making their own world. But those pieces of war remained icons of war. I mean, now we get requests all the time for that very famous picture called the 2,000-yard stare of a shell-shocked Marine. And because it communicates so truly what they have experienced.
For things like that, how did Tom Lea capture those things? Did he sketch them on board or take photographs and then come back and do his painting? Or how did that work with him usually?
He did, you know, I've thought about just how you would do that. But he, when he was at war, he took a notebook, a sketch pad, and a few implements of an artist, a pencil and some inks and brushes. And he would make sketches and then come back here and paint them. But you know how our lives are so busy and hurried and rushed, but to think of someone that would be able to capture while on the sandy beaches of Peleliu with shrapnel flying and seeing pieces like the Price where someone is hit by it, but to be able, he wrote a little a paragraph about it. He was always very brief in his descriptions, but how benumbing it was, and how, you know, just, I wish I had his words to say what the experience was like. But a book of those sketches was published. They've been published actually in Texas Monthly too. But then finished paintings would be done in his studio.
So he would make sketches and then he'd make notes about how he felt and what the experience was like, and then he'd go back and try to capture that and recreate that in the studio.
Right. He made, at the beginning he made notes. Michael Tomar last year read some of his notes from a war book that the El Paso Museum of Art owns, and he said to the audience, he says, this is like poetry. You know, the color of the wake, you know, the color of the sky, where blue turned to gray. He would usually make notes like that. He told me that by the end of the war, he had a photographic memory, and so he really got, so he didn't make so many of those notes. He did not make notes about feelings. He made notes about what he saw.
Now, you've described his extraordinary ability to observe and to experience, his insight into looking at what's underneath the foundation of imagery and that kind of thing. What kind of a man was he spiritually? Was he a Christian?
Yeah, he grew, my great-grandfather baptized him in the Baptist church. So yes, Tom Lea was a Christian. He and his wife, both, Sarah, were. But he was very, you know, we talked about that a little bit, about it. Because I knew Tom Lea so well, and he might not talk as much about Christ, someone out of history who came, I think he identified more with the Spirit. You know, people I've admired in my life so often who are not Christian, they come from a different background, but I've recognized something in them that is part of my faith walk as a Christian, growing up in the Baptist church. But it comes at it maybe more from the Father side or more from the Spirit side. And Tom always had a great admiration for indigenous cultures and the Indians. And in a lot of his pictures, he always kind of believed in traveling light. He didn't gather a lot of things in this life. I mean, if he could have been an Indian, he might have been an Indian, you know, but he had a great reverence for God's creation.
So he really lived that out in his paintings and how he lived his life. And you said that you know him well. What kind of a person was he? If you sat down to talk with him, what would a conversation be like with him?
Well, he would probably be relatively quiet until you asked him something. You know, he'd be always very courteous. But there was, I think I'd mentioned in my last interview that there was just a sense of this full, in a quiet way, a full awareness of the wonder of being alive. Mm-hmm. And periodically, he didn't talk about it a lot, but I think I mentioned last time being in his office at the end of his life when he had every reason to be depressed because he couldn't see anymore, he couldn't work anymore. He had to give up his studio so that someone who could care for them could move in. That was a very hard process. And I love seeing how his wife handled it. She let him do it on his own good time. But how sitting in his studio with Jonathan Yardley from the New York Times, and the room was getting kind of dark. Jonathan Yardley had come out to do an interview because President Bush had quoted Tom Lea about living on the east side of the mountain, the sunrise side of the mountain, the side to see the day that is coming, and not the side to see the day that is gone. But when I turned the light on to make it a little bit brighter, it was getting so dark, and how he said to Jonathan Yardley, "Do you see the way that light is cast off those books? That's beautiful to me." And he would say things like backlit, like leaves being backlit. And when you see his wife, this most beautiful portrait that he did of his wife, Sarah, in the summertime after the war, he did it as a votive offering in the gratefulness of being home, but how she's backlit. So the light is coming from behind and there's light over her shoulders. And when you think of that, well, even symbolically, to let light shine through you, I mean, that's what Christians profess, that the light shines through you. But now on my walk along the levee, when my granddaughter gets old enough, I'm going to point out to her, you know, just how beautiful the leaves are when you can see the light coming through them. You can see so much more of them. I mean, they become fully themselves rather than kind of flattened. Sometimes when the light's on you, like this light, when it's like on you, it can flatten.
Right.
There's something really very profound about that, I think.
Yeah. And so he was able to just travel throughout the day and notice the nuances of the light and the subtlety of colors and sounds and experiences that a lot of us miss.
Well, having known him, I felt like I was skimming life, I will say. I think he's deepened my experience of life. And it's not to be overly romantic about it. I mean, he talked about making art was probably, I forgot what percentage, but, you know, 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. I mean, it's hard work, too.
Sure.
But he was a joyful man in a very quiet way.
It sounds, certainly his paintings communicate that. What was it that he saw in El Paso? Why did he make this his home base for most of his life? And El Paso's actually gotten a lot more sophisticated and cultured over time, and when he was here as a young man and so forth, it was a pretty parochial place, right?
Well, it was an interesting place, though, you know, and when I look back at these old pictures of his, I mean, the fact that you would go over to Juarez, you know, you go to the bullfights over there, and the fact that you had people, he talked about, you know, the man who would be watering his yard or something, he spoke a different language, and even as a little boy, he wanted to communicate with them, so he learned a different language. You know, living during the Mexican Revolution. This is a very rich place, and I think he always found it infinitely interesting. I think he also, I know he loved the mountains. And in the front of one of his books, in The Primal Yoke, it has a quote from the Analects, but it's about people living around water. I wish I could remember the exact quote. The wise man, it's about the wise man preferring water over mountains. But the mountains, he always said there was a sense of security because they don't move. You know, they're always there. And even when they do change with the light, with the clouds, with the season, they're always there. The basic structure is always there. And Tom Lea, you always sense there was always this basic, I like to credit to growing up in the church and knowing scripture and knowing at the end of his life he could recite Bible verses. There were prayers that he had written out like illuminated manuscripts that he penned up in his studio.
Do we have any of those? Do you
I
know?
have one at our house. In fact, it's hanging in my husband Dee's office.
Oh. Yeah, we'll have to get that on the website, get a photo of it.
Yeah,
right.
I'd like to share it.
Yeah. It is interesting because mountains obviously have a strong significance biblically from the standpoint of Mount Sinai to Mount Horeb to almost many significant events take place on the mountains. So I think you may be onto something there, definitely. How should we view one of his paintings? If you were going to say, okay, Holly, you know nothing about art, this is, other than just experiencing it, these are the kinds of questions you might ask yourselves, or these are the things that you might look at. What would you advise me?
Well, of course, you can take a painting apart, and it's interesting to do it because you can see, even by his preparation, just what a craftsman he was, in every stroke meaning something. I've thought a lot about the way I talk a lot and things. It's like he kind of, when he spoke, each word meant something. Each stroke on the canvas meant something. There were no flourishes. So you can look at, if you go look at the mural, for instance, that big mural at the El Paso Public Library, you can see how each, there are these building blocks of color, fine craftsmanship in the way he laid paint on. But then you can see some of his work is very, much more modern, which in modern art, generally you distill things down. The traditional sense of art was the picture plane as a window onto the world, and you present perspective and things getting smaller as they go back in a realistic way. But he flattened a lot of things as well too, in a much more modern way. The piece Snake Dancers is very much like that. And it's also very similar to a painting that became quite a sensation in the 1920s, which was Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending the Staircase. So it's not like he was unaware, like he was some local yokel who didn't know anything about modern art. He knew a lot of things about many things, but he used it in the context of the Southwest and subjects that he knew. And Snake Dancers.
And he also, unlike a lot of the modern artists, he didn't just evolve into increasingly modern art, increasingly abstract art. He really adjusted what he was doing for the subject matter more, right?
Right, yes, it does. And I've kind of seen, since I was in the art business for so long, we have kind of, because of the way we learn about art and how this happened then, and then this happened this, and this style then, and this style then, how we can limit ourselves, or we can start feeling really insecure about what's appropriate for today. And he really didn't, he just used the style as subject demanded. And, there's something really very refreshing about that.
Right, absolutely. How did he communicate his faith in his art?
Well, I think,
or did he? Maybe he did.
Well, I think he did, very much so. In fact, there's some very overt expressions of his faith. There is one piece that's called Altar of the Earth. It belongs to Jack and Carol Maxon here locally, but where the hand of God is actually in the clouds of the sky. It's called Altar of the Earth. So there are pieces like that that are very overt. He did a mother and child for the Doble family. They were Catholic friends. Louis Doble was an architect here and a friend, and so he did one of a cowboy. One of his Christmas cards was an old cowboy looking up at a star, the North Star, and saying to his pal, "You reckon it's the same one, Slim?" So his faith was expressed, I think, in his art. But generally, Tom Lea was someone, I think, I appreciated him so much because he didn't correct me. There was so much of me that needed correcting when I was dealing with him, and he never corrected me. And I'm so grateful because he kind of let me learn my own way, which is really, I think, a sign of real love.
Yeah, and
to allow
reverence,
people,
yeah.
and reverence for what your purpose is in life, or it's not the same as what I might think it should be.
Right, yeah. Why should the average person make an effort to at least pick out a couple of Tom Lea events this month? And I mean, people are busy, they'd rather maybe go see a movie than go to an art event or art function. Why should we make the effort to attend?
Well, I think they'll find nourishment in our speakers and in our programming. I'm hoping so. I haven't heard all of them. In fact, that's an interesting point about Tom Lea Month. It's not like all these people I've gone and sought out for Tom Lea Month. Like I have this idea in my head. They've really kind of come to us. For instance, this woman who's speaking on Dan Longwell, who was the editor, the inventor of Life magazine, she called me because she's doing a biography on him and she wanted to use Tom Lea's portrait of him. So then I started thinking, well, you'd be a good speaker for Tom Lea Month. Tom Hatfield, who's an outstanding historian, I found out he had always admired Tom Lea and had gone to Peleliu and actually landed on those beaches.
Wow.
And so I think it'll be nourishing for people. I think they'll learn a lot, and it is for, if you look at the book or go online and see subjects that interest you or even that don't interest, I think you're going to find a lot of things that are very interesting and as diverse as, you know, pastry making at the White House to World War II.
Yeah. Well, when I looked at the catalog and I looked online, I was astounded at the number of events. There have to be at least 50 different things happening, and so there's no excuse not to be able to fit one or two things in, at least, I think, definitely.
And there are different times of day,
yeah, right.
and things like that. Mimi Gladstein, who's our advisor from UTEP, she had advised me not to do so much, but it's like I can't control, I mean, I can't help it. I mean, and there's so much more we're planning for next year.
Yes.
So it's a desire to share it, and these people who are coming to present really want to share with El Paso.
And it could also potentially be a much more intimate setting than being this big mammoth event all the time, that you are actually going to have the opportunity to interact with the people who are presenting.
Absolutely,
and that sort of thing.
You will.
Yeah.
Shake their hand and you know, absolutely it will be.
Well, Adair, this is very exciting. I'm looking forward to it, and I really thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you for inviting me again. I always enjoy coming. Thank you, Holly.
Good. Are you inspired to expand your horizons, maybe to enrich your life? Invite someone and plan to attend at least a few events commemorating Tom Lea Month during October. Thank you very much.